right, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get going. We're just a few minutes before the top of the hour, but we have a few reminders that I want to get through before we kick things off. So welcome to the Caneberry Session at the Savannah Fruit and Vegetable Meeting. We're very glad to have you join us today. We'll have 2 talks and then a grower panel and then 2 more talks today, and then we'll kick things off again tomorrow morning. Just a note, if you're looking at your program, tomorrow morning Dave Bryla is listed as the first speaker. We're actually going to switch things up and have Amanda Davis, who's right now the second speaker, have her go first. She wasn't able to join us in person, so she's going to join us remotely via Zoom, and so she'll be our first speaker, and then Dave will come in as our second speaker. But other than that, that's the only change to the schedule right now. I do want to acknowledge some of our moderators for this session and also people who have helped put some effort into organizing the session. So we have Karen here from North Carolina Cooperative Extension. She was a board member of the North American Raspberry and Blackberry Growers Association, and we worked with the executive secretary, Darcy, of NARBA, kind of as a team to put this program together. So we're looking forward to having some nice speakers from across the United States share some of their research with you all. So just a few reminders quickly. There is free Wi-Fi that is sponsored by the Specialty Crop Group Industry. The username is the Southeast Regional Conference, and then the password is there. It's 2024 SEREG, all lowercase. So we appreciate them sponsoring the free Wi-Fi. There is an app, so you can download the conference schedule and all the other information there. There's the QR code if you want to connect with exhibitors, see the speakers and sponsors and full schedule of events. And also there's a map of the trade show. For any of you that need to do your pesticide CEU credits, there's a little scanner over by the door. If you came in early and it wasn't working, please try it again. We had the technician up and I think he's fixed it now, so it should work. You just have to show the little QR code that you have up in the corner of your name tag and scan that and you'll get credit. And thanks so much to all of the sponsors and exhibitors. Please do plan to visit the trade show. The trade show kicks off tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. and will be open on Saturday as well. And then finally, this conference actually received support from USDA to help make it possible, so we appreciate their support, and then also the Georgia Department of Agriculture for their efforts in making the conference happen. And if you've never participated in this meeting before, there's also a silent auction that's just outside of the trade show, so just to the right of where you registered, and you can definitely participate there. And there's the QR code if you would like to check things out. And then finally, all of the educational sessions are going to be recorded and will be available to all of you that registered after the conference. And then you probably saw me passing out some of those orange sheets. So those are the surveys that we would like for you all to fill out at the end of the session, just to get feedback on what did you like, what did you find valuable, what would you like to see going forward. We do take those into consideration when putting together the program, so it's always helpful to have just any feedback that you're willing to share. And with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Karen, and she's going to be talking about evaluating raspberry cultivars for southeastern markets. Thanks for joining us, Karen.
Great, good afternoon. Hope you guys are awake after our big lunch we had. So I'm Karen Blado, and I work with North Carolina Cooperative Extension. I'm a small fruit and vegetable agent, and I am stationed in the western part of North Carolina. So I'm in the mountains. It's beautiful if you haven't been there. So I'm close to Asheville, that area. And today I'm going to talk about a cultivar trial for raspberries that I did in the western part of the state and give you guys some updates on what we found. So first off, I'm going to get started with, well, why am I doing this? What's the goal of the project? So one of the missions of Extension is that we provide growers with current information, and that's the key. And so our Caneberry Southeast Regional Guide, which is a really great guide, it came out in 2016. And there are a lot of raspberry cultivars that have been released since this publication. So one of the ideas was, hey, we need to try some of these new raspberries that are actually being offered by nurseries in North Carolina so that growers know how they will perform. So that was one of the main reasons, is we need to update this guide, and it's currently being done, and we'll add some of this information to it. The other is that I have several blackberry growers that I work with that would like to move into having more raspberries. So they want to increase their market diversity, and they wanted to know about these cultivars as well. So those were the two main drivers. And then I do want to thank the Small Fruit Research Consortium. They actually give out small grants to extension agents, and I was one of them, where I got some funding to be able to do this trial on a farm. So those are some of the reasons we took this project on. And really the other goal is, through this work, hopefully we can identify a cultivar that has excellent yield, of course, right? We want that yield. That's your price there. But we also need some shelf life. Raspberries are extremely perishable. So we want to find something that has a shelf life and also plant vigor. One thing we struggle with is that the raspberry plants, the longevity can struggle a little bit in the southeast with some of our heat. So we're trying to see which ones will last longer. All right, so I'm going to just go down the list of some of the different cultivars that we looked at. So some of these have been out for a little while, but we didn't know how they performed in North Carolina or really the Southeast. And so Nantahala is kind of our control for North Carolina. It was released from NC State. We know it does well, so we put that in the trial. And then Heritage is from Cornell. That's also another standard. And then we looked at the Crimson, a bunch of different Crimson lines, Treasure, Night, and Giant. Those all came out of Dr. Courtney Weber's program at Cornell. I wanted to know how those would perform. And then Double Gold. We also looked at two from Oregon, a USDA, that's Vintage and Kokanee. And then we also have two advanced breeding lines from Dr. Gina Fernandez's program. They're just numbered right now. Unfortunately, those were a little bit hard to get clean in tissue culture, so we weren't able to plant them until this year in 2023. So I won't be able to give you data until next year on those. But that's the list of the cultivars we looked at this trial. So this is planted in the western part of the state, and this is an on-farm trial. It's at a raspberry farm where the grower has been in raspberry production for 19 years. So he is very knowledgeable, has been growing raspberries a long time. His markets are primarily local, but he has a little bit of wholesale. So he sells to other farmers that have farm stands, for example, or he sells to bakers, but he also does some wholesale production as well. So this farm was a great site to put this trial in. But if you look at our conditions, we are actually a subtropical climate. We get a lot of rain. We get above the national average, so we get about 52 inches. And in the past, a lot of the raspberries, if you look at the nursery recommendations, they're going to say zone 4 to 7, right? So you can see that the USDA just updated the zones in 2023, and the area that I currently work in is changed. In the past, it was 6A, 6B, and 7s, which was good for raspberry production. Now we're up to some areas in Henderson County are actually 8A. So it's getting warmer. So we'll have to see in the future how some of these raspberries hold up under these conditions. So that's where this was at, if you have any questions. So this is just an overview of sort of what it looks like at the site. We built raised beds, of course. Raspberries can be pretty prone to root rot, so we wanted to pull that soil up to get good drainage. We also used all standard practices. He's been growing for 19 years, so we just used a lot of the standard practices. We do use weed-free landscape fabric strips on either side of our beds. That's been really great for controlling weeds in addition to using herbicide treatments. We also fertigate and irrigate the raspberries. For the growers that I work with in the West, they were primarily interested in primocane fruit. They didn't want, you can double crop some of these, but they didn't really want to look at the double cropping, the floricane. They wanted to just look at the primocane crop. So that's what we did for this study. So for that, the management is actually a lot nicer because they mow everything to the ground in the winter when things are dormant. So the plant health seems to be there when we have a primocane crop. Also, they're looking for certain market windows, and I'll show you a calendar in a minute about when these harvests were peaking, but they're really looking for like that July, August window. So the primocane fruit fit into that. All right, so some of the things that we took a look at was, for these cultivars, went out there and took a lot of different phenology data about when they emerged in the spring, the primocanes themselves, to when they flowered, to when they fruited. And the reason we're taking all that data is I want to identify the window that a grower will be harvesting and selling. So we're trying to find those optimal market windows. And then, of course, with fruit quality, that's really important because that's where our shelf life and the wholesale market piece can really play in. So we needed to know how these berries held up. So some of the things we looked at, of course, was the berry size. That matters to your customers. So we looked at the berry weight. We would harvest at 3 different intervals. It would be early harvest, mid, and late. And we would take 25 berries in a clamshell, and then we would weigh those to get the single weight. So that's kind of a standard practice for cultivar trials. The other thing that we did is we looked for leakage, and it's a super simple test. You basically put the raspberry on a filter paper, and you look to see if any juice is coming out of any of those droplets. And this will play into whether or not something might be good for shipping versus not. So we did the leakage. We also did firmness, and this is subjective. So the same person always did the firmness test because it's very subjective, and you're basically using a scale that's from 1 to 9. 1 is very soft, 5 is moderately firm, and then 9 is firm. And we use that to determine basically if the berry might be able to hold up, in clamshell shipping. The other thing that we looked at was Brix, which is basically the sugar, so that's how sweet the raspberries are. And I use a handheld meter, it's called an otagometer, to do the Brix. And then I also looked at acidity. And these two things play into flavor for what your customer is experiencing. So we analyzed that from all of the different cultivars. We also stored clamshells in a refrigerator for 7 days just to see how they would hold up, to see if there was weight loss, but also we looked at decay. So this kind of helps give us a picture of the shelf life and whether or not they might have the potential to be shipped. The other thing is we used a formula, and I'll get into this in a little bit, to estimate yield. It would be lovely if I could go out there and weigh every berry and I could separate them from marketable yield and the culls, but that is very difficult, as you guys know. It's very hard to do that with caneberries. That's one of the challenges that people have as researchers. So we used an estimation. I'll show you what that is. The other thing we did is we did a blind taste test with the Publix. We had I wish we had more people, but we had about 25 at a farmer's market, and it was a mix of adults and children, and we had them rate the berries. So now the data, and then you guys, if you have questions once I get done, you can ask me. So these are the windows that these different cultivars were coming off for the harvest in western North Carolina. So you can see Crimson Treasure, Kokanee, and Vintage were our earliest primocane fruiters for the West. So they started in July, and their peak was definitely in August, which a lot of the growers like. So they were peaking, and then they were still picking in September with those 3. So in August, Crimson Night started along with Heritage, which is kind of a standard. So that was about the second week. And then Nantahala kicks in about mid-August. And then you can see our Crimson Giant and Double Gold were the latest. They were quite late, actually, and this can be a challenge in our area because we can get a frost in October. So if your peak harvest is happening at the end of September and then you get a frost, it may shorten how many weeks you're actually able to harvest. So that's one challenge we saw with Crimson Giant and Double Gold, but they were our latest. So then we did all of those measurements to get the average berry size, and this is the results for how much each one weighs. To give you guys an idea, so Crimson Treasure was the largest berry out of our entire trial, and then Kokanee and Vintage were pretty similar, just a little bit smaller than Crimson Treasure. And then Nantahala right behind it. So all of those were pretty large berry-sized raspberries. And then for like a medium-sized berry, Crimson Giant and Crimson Knight were more medium-sized. And our smallest berries in the whole trial were Heritage and Double Gold. I've got some pictures so you guys can see the berries a little bit better. So here you can see Crimson Treasure is the largest. It's a really uniform conical shaped raspberry. It was really, it's a very pretty berry. And so that was the largest. And then Kokanee and Vintage are pretty close in size. And Vintage though has like a deeper purple color, which could be of interest to your customers. So those are the differences in the larger berries here. And then, of course, Nantahala is one of our standards. It was kind of a medium size. Crimson Giant was about the same size, and Crimson Knight a little bit smaller. So Crimson Knight is definitely the darkest of all the berries. It's a very deep purple. So that one was quite striking. I'll show a picture in a second. You can see the comparison. And then here are our smaller berries. So we've got Heritage and Double Gold. So Double Gold was the smallest of the whole trial. And then the picture on the right, you can see them side by side. So you can see Crimson Treasure at the very bottom, how large it is compared to Double Gold, the number 8 at the top. So there's quite a bit of a difference there. So then for yield, this is a challenge because, we couldn't go out and harvest everything and weigh it. We actually let the grower, because this was a collaboration with him, he actually harvested and sold a lot of these things to his markets. But I always was able to go in and do my sampling before he harvested. So for the yield estimate, we actually took this from a paper from Dale and Fisher where they estimate yield in raspberries in Ontario. And to do this, we take those weights that we took through the season. So we have like a single berry weight, but then we also went in and counted the number of canes, like in a meter squared area. You can see my PVC to like mark that. So I measured the number of canes, and then we just at random within that meter square, we picked 3 canes, and we counted the number of flowers and fruit on those canes. And then from there, we can get a yield estimate. So the formula is there at number 4. So it's basically the average cane number in that meter squared, and it's multiplied by the average berry weight and the average number of flowers per cane. Keep in mind, this yield estimate does not take into consideration quality, culls, marketable yield. It's just the potential of the plant based off of the number of canes it's putting out there and the number of flowers. So these are the results that we found this year, and we'll repeat it again. But Vintage definitely had the highest yield potential. But you'll see with some of my quality data in a minute, Vintage has some issues with shelf life and leakage and so forth. So I think that if we actually looked at culls, this probably would have been more similar to Kokanee and Crimson Treasure. So Kokanee and Crimson Treasure have more yield potential than Nantahala, which is our standard for North Carolina. So that's good. I'm excited about that. So that looks really great. And then Double Gold and Crimson Knight were a little less than Nantahala, but pretty much everything we looked at has a higher yield potential than Heritage, which is an old standard from Cornell. So I think the cultivars are improving from what I'm seeing, which is good for growers. So here's some of the fruit quality that we looked at from all the different berries. So I'm not going to go through every single one. I just want to highlight some things that came out of that. So the average Brix is that sugar content, again, that we're looking at in the berries. So Nantahala was the sweetest berry. So Dr. Fernandez would be happy to hear that. And then Double Gold was also pretty sweet. So you've got those. And then Kokanee. So those three were like our sweeter berries. And then you can see from the chart that's looking at acidity, the Crimson Knight and Crimson Treasure and Crimson Giant, all of those had a little bit more acidity, especially Giant and Treasure. Those had quite a bit more acidity. For a balanced berry, I would say Vintage and Crimson Knight and Heritage had that really nice Brix and TA ratio. So those are some of the differences we saw in the sugars and the acid. So then we also looked at firmness, and this is going to play a pretty big role for shelf life. And we tested over 75 berries for firmness, so we had to kind of average out some of that data. But basically, you'll see that Crimson Giant is the firmest berry. That's pretty blurry, huh? Oh, okay, you see. So Crimson Giant was the firmest berry that we had, and then Kokanee is also pretty firm, and Nantahala, all of those kind of ranked up there. The takeaway from the firmness graph is that Double Gold had the least firmness. It's very soft, a very soft berry from our trials. And then for the weight loss, we put these clamshells in the fridge for 7 days, and we looked at the weight loss in storage. And you can see that it correlates, the firmness to the weight loss. So Double Gold also lost the most weight in storage. Crimson Knight also had a little bit less firmness than some of the other cultivars. It also lost quite a bit of weight in storage. So those are some of the pieces to take away from these slides. We also looked at percent leakage. And so for this one, Vintage, you remember that one's got the most yield potential, but it's got the highest leakage rate here. So that's just something to consider. So the Vintage had a lot of juice. I found that raspberries don't have very much juice when you compare them to blackberries. Like, it was actually hard for me to get enough for some of my tests. And so this one, though, had quite a bit, the Vintage did. And then Nantahala actually had, and it's our standard, it had some leakage as well, even though it's a really good berry. But you can see that Crimson Giant, Kokanee, and Heritage had very little. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then for the percent decay, Double Gold, right, softest, most leakage, it had the most decay as well in our trials. And then Vintage and Crimson Knight had some decay as well. Okay, here are the results from the taste test. This was with the public at the market. We took berries and had them tell us if they thought they were poor, fair, good, or excellent, and then we transferred that into a number and then averaged it all out. So that's how we got this information. So they're all pretty close, and taste tests are very subjective. People either really like things really sweet or really acidic. You'll find those two palates happening at the market, but anyways, the breeders are always interested in this information, so we did it. Crimson Knight was the winner. So it actually either scored between good and excellent for flavor most of the time, but that one just kind of pulled ahead of the rest a little bit. And then Crimson Treasure, Kokanee, and Crimson Giant also all had really good ratings over Nantahala. So that was interesting to see. Whereas our standard Heritage was the least favorite of all of our taste testers. All right, so I'm going to wrap up with some conclusions, and then if you guys have some questions. So the ones that we really found probably have the most shipping potential, and we'll continue to explore this, would definitely be Crimson Treasure and Kokanee. Those stood out in terms of firmness, leakage, and didn't have a ton in weight, and the weight loss and no decay. The other thing about these two is they were our earliest ones. These are the ones we started harvesting in July, going into August. This is the window that the growers are also very interested in. They also had high yield potential. So these two cultivars look to be pretty promising. They kind of fit a lot of the different characteristics we were looking for. And I just putting into Halo so you could see how it compares with our standard, either better or, these are all going to be primocane. Yeah. And then the other conclusion, which you guys are probably not surprised based off the data that I showed you, double gold definitely needs to be more of a local market. It was the least firm, very soft berry, a lot of leakage, and quite a bit of weight loss and storage. But it is an interesting berry. It's very yellowish. It could be good for a local market, kind of add that niche, but it just did not hold up for us. Vintage as well. It's a purplish berry, but it didn't hold up great. Crimson Night, you remember, was the best flavored one, so this could be really great for a local market as well. So this, I'm just going to show you the double gold. It was the tallest of all the canes that we looked at, so a very vigorous plant. That's on the left there. But the berries themselves, we saw that they really couldn't handle rain damage, and we got quite a bit of sun scald on them. But I really think the key thing with this one, too, was that it came off so late in our season that I think the heat of August and September just really took a toll on these berries in this plant. But yeah, the berries are very soft, so and we just didn't get the yield potential that we thought we would. And then Crimson Night, as far as like plant health, it stood out. Very sturdy canes, very, very healthy plant. And the berry is just like this very deep purple, so it was really beautiful, but yeah, it had some leakage issues. So that might be something to consider for the local market. And it did rate good to excellent for the taste test. And then for vintage, this has our most yield potential, but we did see some problems with the leakage and the decay and the weight loss. But the canes too, it was a little bit more flimsy, needed a little bit more support. But you can see this over here. It would be loaded with berries, so I could see the yield is definitely promising with this one. And then Crimson Giant was the shortest, because then, I don't know, I didn't expect that with the name. I thought it would also be the largest berry, but it wasn't. But it's a really well-behaved plant, really beautiful. But this one also came off so late that I think the heat kind of took a toll on this plant. So I'm going to wrap up with this. Kokanee definitely has a lot of potential for us. It's a firm berry. It's one of the earliest to emerge. It has good high yield potential and a good taste. So Kokanee is one we are going to keep an eye on. And then Crimson Treasure also shined above all the other cultivars in the trial on pretty good firmness. It emerged late. The primocanes themselves, we had no cold damage with this one, which was really exciting because we get late frost in the west, in the mountains of North Carolina. And this is the largest berry, so it looks really awesome in a clamshell. So that's sort of my conclusion. So I'll wrap up just by thanking a couple of people. I have this wonderful program assistant that goes and takes a lot of data for me, Isaac. Wyatt, in extension, we wear multiple hats. I wish I could just work on one thing sometimes, but I'm always all over the place, and I really want to be able to provide this information to growers, so it's helpful to have someone like Isaac to help me. And then I want to thank the growers. So Larry Stepp is the grower I'm currently doing this trial on, but also I want to thank Dalton Rhodes from Rhodes Berry Farm. We put this same trial in at his farm, this in 2023, so I'll have 2 farms with more data for next year. And then, of course, Philotech, they provided the plants, and they currently sell all of these cultivars that I tested. And then Dr. Gina Fernandez, Courtney Weber, and Penny Perkins-Easy, they've all contributed either plants or insight into the trial. All right, yes. So we were looking at, I mean, if they could be a little bit earlier, July would actually be ideal. So in our area, the ones that come in May and June are going to be the floricane fruiters. And we were just looking at primocane fruiters.
Would there be any, I'm in the central part of the state, North Carolina, would there be any that would, primocane fruiters that would come in June in that location?
I think you would shift, our dates would probably shift 3 weeks early for you because your primocans would emerge 3 weeks earlier than us. We're actually looking at a project. We did a little bit of prelim stuff this past year. We're using some row covers in February over the primocanes that have been cut, they've been cut back, so there's nothing there on the ground. So we put row covers to try to force the primocanes early to push our window 2 to 3 weeks early, and we would be in that July time. So yeah, it's possible that in your area it might be a couple of weeks earlier. That would be the 3 that were our earliest in the mountains. So that would be Kokanee, Crimson Treasure, and Vintage. But if you're looking, yeah, so those would be the 3 that were the earliest. Don't know if we have time for any more other questions, but yeah, okay, great.
What was the standard spray program that you used on it?
Yeah, so it was, I mean, he basically has been doing this for a long time, but he does take the recommendations from the IPM guide that comes out every year, and has like a rotation that he follows. So, every 7 days he's spraying a fungicide and then insecticides during the ripening process for the berries. So he wasn't spraying for spotted wing until we got into more of the color change of the berry. The other thing we're seeing issues with, which is a totally another topic, is botrytis, a lot of fungicide resistance. So we've been incorporating some new organic products into the spray schedule because we are having a lot of resistance issues. But it was just a typical conventional spray schedule.
And what pests did you observe? Raspberry crown borer?
We did not have raspberry crown borer. He has had that in the past at his place, but this year the plants, maybe because they're so young, we really didn't see a lot of pest pressure. We did notice some botrytis, but I did a resistance screen at Clemson and found some of the stuff we were using was no longer effective. So once we switched to different fungicides that weren't resistant, the resistance wasn't there, we got control pretty quickly after that. So botrytis is probably our biggest problem. Okay. Okay. You're welcome. I'm gonna pull Lisa up.
Here you go.
Oh, thank you.
Here's your gift.
Thank you. I might need this on Friday.
All right, so we're going to continue on with the topic of raspberries and presenters from North Carolina. Our next presenter is Lisa Rayburn, and she's going to give us some updates on work she's been doing with long cane raspberry production in eastern North Carolina. So thanks for joining us, Lisa.
Thank you, Amanda. What I'd like to talk about today is a wrap-up of 2 years of work that we've done evaluating using pine bark as an alternative to coco coir for the substrate production of long cane raspberries in the eastern U.S. So there's been a lot of interest in substrate production, and of course in the hot, humid conditions of the southeast, we can't grow a raspberry in the ground as a perennial crop. So what we're looking at is a containerized long cane raspberry system. I know many of you are familiar with the concept by now, but if you're not, we're dealing with plants that we purchase in, we bump them up into pots in high tunnels, and we're growing them essentially as an annualized crop within that high tunnel system. Our research is located on farm in southeastern North Carolina. We have really great grower support, which has made this project possible. We're With the new USDA hardiness zone maps, we're right there on the cusp between zone 8A and 8B. We're buying in dormant plants. Our plants look a lot like that plant on the left-hand side of this picture. It's got 2 canes in 1 pot. They come to us from the nursery. We've been purchasing them from a nursery in Canada. And then we bring them out of the cooler and we put them out in a high tunnel. And the concept here is that by pushing them earlier in the spring, we can get those raspberries out before the heat of the summer really tanks our fruit quality and berry size. So if we don't get out of these tunnels by about the middle of June, things get too hot, berries get too mushy, and they just don't become marketable. So in the first year, we did pine bark in 2 of the 4 tunnels and Coco Coir in the other 2 tunnels. And then in the subsequent year, we swapped those. So each substrate was represented in each tunnel over the course of 2 seasons. We're pulling our plants out of the cooler typically in late January. So we actually had a January pullout date, January 24th and 25th, both seasons. And those plants are dormant, but after a couple of weeks, we start to see some good bud break and lateral growth coming off of those canes. Each year we do, unfortunately, have to deal with some frost protection. That's really a labor issue. We're getting row covers up and over the plants within the tunnel. And we've had to do that each season. I think that's one of the challenges for us in the Northeast, in the Southeast. We have variable weather in a way that we don't necessarily if we're dealing with a grower in California who has that kind of moderated Mediterranean climate. We don't have that. We've got a lot of ups and downs here. And we're typically seeing our harvest start around mid-April. Our goal is to see these plants produce fruit in the same time frame as strawberries so we can co-market them along with strawberries. And so we've hit about a mid-April time frame each year. We're using a 2-tank fertility system. So in our pump house, we have a tank A and a tank B for each of our tunnels, and that lets us manage fertility within the tunnel. In tank A, we've got a calcium nitrate solution, and in tank B, we have a solution that has phosphorus, potassium, and micronutrients in it as well. We use a pretty low-tech yet effective irrigation system within the tunnels. We have buckets where we monitor both our fertilizer solution that drips into the system as well as our drain solution that comes out of some sentinel pots within the tunnel. And by monitoring pH and EC in these buckets, we're able to kind of keep we know what's going on in the system, and we can adjust our irrigation system to maintain our target values. So we're running a target EC of 1.6 during the vegetative phase, and a target EC during the fruiting phase that's 1.3, or just a little bit lower than that. And we adjust irrigation timing and frequency to stay within those target values. One of the things that we're looking at is this is a great system. The system has a lot of promise. The system is not cheap. So what are the ways that we can make this system more accessible or more attainable to us within the Southeast? And one of the things we're looking at is, can we use a locally produced pine bark product as an alternative to Coco Coir within this system? So Coco Coir is really the industry standard. That's what growers in Europe and Canada are using. But we've seen in the last couple of years supply chain issues and concerns about shipping that we haven't necessarily seen in the past, right? When COVID came through, we had growers who were concerned that they could not get Coco Coir shipments. They had plants to put in the ground, but they weren't sure if they were going to be able to get the Coco Coir that they needed at the time that they needed it. So pine bark offers some real advantages. One, we can produce it locally, so we can help shorten some of those supply chain issues. Growers can be confident that they can get what they need. But it doesn't necessarily have the water handling characteristics that Coco Coir does. Coco Coir has some really good water holding capacity, lateral water movement, aeration within the pot. Pine bark isn't quite as high speed, but it can do the job. We just have to manage for that substrate. The other thing we have to think about is we have to have a supplier that can produce the substrate that we need. But it does present us with a potential significant cost savings. It costs us about $1.30 to fill a pot with Coco Coir. It costs us about 30 cents to fill that same pot with pine bark. So a substantial savings there. We had some samples sent to Dr. Brian Jackson at NC State, and he did some physical property analysis for us that confirmed what we thought. We tried to get our pine bark as close to Coco Coir as we could, but we could only get so close. So we can see that Coco Coir still had more total porosity, higher container capacity, and a lower bulk density. So it's a lighter weight product. It holds water better than the pine bark does. So we adjusted our irrigation system for pine bark. Essentially, if you think about it, these plants still need the same amount of water and nutrients, but if pine bark's not going to hold as much water, we provide it with shorter, more frequent irrigation intervals than we do Coco Coir to maintain moisture within the pot. So we're going to compare two seasons, and I just want to give you kind of an overview of the seasons so that you can see, as this plays out in the data, a little bit of what we were dealing with. In 2022, we had some heat stress in May, and the one thing that raspberries really don't like is heat stress. Generally, our irrigation system ran drier, and it had higher EC in 2022 than it did in 2023. In 2022, we saw our first pick around the 13th to the 17th of April, and I say 13th to 17th because it was really the 17th of April by the time we were picking the volumes that we picked on our first pick in 2023. In both seasons, our peak production was in May, and in both seasons, our last pick was the exact same date, 8th of June. In 2023, we really lucked out. We could not have asked for better weather than we got for growing raspberries in 2023. In 2023, we started out with a warm February that gave us some early bud break, but then the temperatures dropped compared to what they would normally be, and we had a relatively cool April and May. And that was great because we were picking berries under cooler temperatures, which those plants really liked. Generally speaking, our irrigation system ran a little wetter and our EC was a little lower. So this is just a side-by-side showing you kind of what the picking season trend was for both years. And you can see that when we look at these trends, there was no difference in timing of the season, regardless of the substrate we were in. They pretty much marched right there side by side together. Then we got to measuring. So we measured a lot of different parameters. We focused on total yield, cull weights, berry size, fruit quality, plant growth, and plant tissue nutrient levels because we were trying to see were there differences in how well these plants performed based on the substrate that they were in. And the first thing that we looked at was total yield. So this is total marketable yield. This is what went in a flat and what went on the truck to be sold. So this was an on-farm trial. The grower provided the labor to pick, and he also sold the fruit. So all of this was marketable quality fruit. And there was no statistical difference in total yield between those two substrates. You can see that our total yield increased in the second season. We had good weather, and we got better at growing raspberries. So that's a good thing. But statistically, there was no difference between pine bark and Coco Coir in terms of total yield. We were able to track cull weights in our second season. And there was no statistical difference in cull weight in our second season. It was interesting to look at the reasons why berries were culled out of the system. And of course, during periods of heat stress, we wind up with berries that get too soft between pickings. We also get some of this lobster clawing or split receptacle. And in 2023, we had a lot of fluctuating temperatures where we fluctuated from cool, overcast conditions to bright bluebird blue skies. And so in 2023, we got some sun scald from that. And I think that's a risk of our environment. In an area where the environment's a little bit more consistent, you're going to see a little bit less of that. But for us, it's always going to be a calculation. When do we need to pull shade to reduce sun scald? We don't really want to pull shade too early because it slows the plants down. But we want to make sure we pull it early enough to reduce that sort of damage. We looked at fruit size. What we did is we came up with measurements of average fruit size. And what we see is when we compare fruit size over comparable dates, that there was no significant difference in fruit size between the substrates. And that's a good thing. We were concerned that, maybe pine bark does not hold moisture as well. If we were accidentally stressing these plants in a way that maybe we couldn't see visually, would it show up as a fruit size reduction? And the answer to that is no, it did not. We also looked at berry quality attributes, so soluble solids or percent bricks and titratable acidity. There was no difference in those berry quality attributes. We also looked at things like polyphenols and anthocyanins, and there were no differences in those characteristics either. We looked for differences in plant growth. And so what this means is we tore a lot of plants up, and we counted and we measured all of the things. So we looked at laterals, roots, and flowers. There was no difference in the number of laterals produced by the plants between these two substrates. So we averaged 20 to 21 laterals per floricane and 5 canes per linear meter within the tunnel. We did, in the first season, we saw a slight difference that did show up statistically in lateral length and dry matter. In that first season, we saw that the plants grown in Coco Coir had longer laterals with more dry matter than the plants grown in pine bark. Now, that difference went away in the second season. And if you remember, I said in the first season we ran drier. And I think what happened is in that first season when we ran drier, particularly early in the season, we stressed the plants in pine bark a little bit more because pine bark doesn't hold water as well, right? So this is something that as we got better and managed our substrate better, that difference went away, okay? But you have to know and understand and manage the substrate that you have. In a dry condition, pine bark is going to give you a little bit less buffer than Coco Coir is because of that water holding capacity. We counted total flowers versus fruitful flowers to see was there a difference in yield caused by plants aborting flowers. And the answer to that is there was no difference. There was no difference in flower number between the media. There was no difference in the number of fruitful flowers between the two medias. We did see that lateral location on the plant had a significant difference in the number of fruitful flowers, but you would think about that, right? You're going to have the flowers in the top of your plant are going to open soonest, and they're going to get pollinated during that early pollination rush. And as you work your way down the plant and into the plant, the number of fruitful flowers goes down. So we wanted to assess root growth, and this was a challenge, and this was a learning curve for us. So we looked at roots in the first year, and Josh Mays with Triest is here with us in the room today. Josh and I stared at a lot of roots together, and we kind of had to wrap our head around something. which is that when you look at the roots early in the season, you've got these nice, bright, white, beautiful roots, the sort of roots we're all looking for when we're looking for roots. But towards the end of March, the roots start to brown out. And by the beginning of May, when your fruit load is really the heaviest, you'll pull that plant out of the pot, and it looks a little scary because those roots have essentially started to harden off and retreat. Now, what we're doing in this long cane system is we're removing primocanes as they come up. So there are no primocanes in the pot. It's just 2 floricanes. And those floricanes are dead set on producing as much fruit as they can. So because we're removing the primocanes, we're not getting active new white root growth at this point in the season. In a system where you were maybe growing some primocanes through, you may have white roots in May. But in a system where you're removing the primocanes, you're not. So what we did is we actually came up with a rating scale. So if you can see all the way on your right, a number 1 was a side of the root ball where 0 to 20% was covered in roots. A 2 was essentially 21 to 40%, and so on and so forth to a 5, which is where 81 to 100% of that side of the root ball was covered in roots. And so what we did is we did root scores at the end of the season to say what was the maximum amount of the pot that the plant had utilized over the course of the season. And we did see, when we crunched the 2022 data, there was a little bit of a difference. Coco Coir did a better job utilizing the entire root zone of the pot than pine bark did in 2022. 2022 was also our drier season, right? In 2023, when our season was wetter, there was no statistical difference in root scores between pine bark and Coco Coir. We also did plant tissue analysis to see were there any differences in how plants were taking up nutrients within these 2 substrates. We had no differences in our macronutrients, so NPK, calcium, sulfur, manganese, copper, sodium. There was no statistical difference in those nutrients. We had a couple micronutrients where we had slight differences, and those were magnesium, iron, zinc, boron, and aluminum. I think most of that was related to pH, but it was not enough to cause any sort of problems within the system. Manganese, iron, zinc, and aluminum were all higher in pine bark in the first year and then higher in Coco Coir in the second year. We also did solution samples, so we analyzed the solution that went into the system, we analyzed the leachate that came out of the containers, and there was no difference in any of the parameters that we looked at in our solution samples. So the conclusion is that pine bark does represent a viable alternative to Coco Coir for substrate production in the Southeast. We had no differences in total yield and berry size. We had no significant differences in fruit quality. We had no negative impact on plant growth or nutrient status. It's a less expensive product. We don't run into supply chain issues with this product. It can be locally produced, so it's not going to get caught up in global events. And the one thing we have to watch with this product is it doesn't hold water as well, so you need to watch your irrigation management and make sure that you provide the plant what it needs in that substrate. And this project was made possible by our farm support. Thank you, Lewis Nursery and Farms, for making this possible. Trieste Ag, support from NC State, Dr. Gina Fernandez and Brian Jackson, and our funding partners.
All right, we're going to kind of switch gears here next. We wanted to kind of do a a reflection on the previous season in terms of marketing and sort of the outlook for the 2024 season. So we asked Jose Saka from Wish Farms to join us and Butler Anderson from Lewis Farms. And they're both very gracious to come and share their expertise on this topic. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Jose first, who's going to give us a little overview. You're going to do it together? Perfect. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end in case people have questions and kind of have a little bit of a discussion. So thank you all.
I guess one of the first things that we want to kind of go over is kind of review last year, the 23 season and what transpired, and kind of give you a heads up of as we get ready to show you these clips here, screens to be able to show you what they represent and why they represent it, our conversations. We went into a season where Mexico was having a very heavy crop from last year and going in, and we were predicting, and Georgia was predicting a heavy crop as well. And North Carolina, which I pretty much represent or have more knowledge of North Carolina than any of the rest of them. But with that being said, there was actually a tsunami of, for lack of better words, of blackberries potentially coming on the market. But some of it didn't work out that way. So gears had to be changed, and to take the positives and the negatives. It's a negative if you're in Georgia or what have you, didn't have the crop that you anticipated, but at the same time, prices regulated a little bit better than they normally do. But even with that being said, with the anticipation of a big crop coming, the marketers have no choice but to go out and ahead of time and sell a crop that we get estimates from our growers, we get estimates from our regions, the best we can. We look at the crop and we take it from there. And at that time, we go to our retailers and either set up ads or set up enough movement, hopefully, to move the crop to where it maintains a price and doesn't fall out like it could potentially do if things aren't set up properly. So just kind of give you a heads up of what last year started at. And Jose, is anything you want to add to that? So that's kind of what we're looking at, and as we start the screens here, we'll be able to show you a little bit more.
So the question is, what are your question number 3? So this is the volume, total volume, and I included California in there, both central and south, and this is Mexico coming in. I figured that Georgia starts with the season around week 20, which is around May 15, May 20 something. So Georgia starts somewhere around right here, and Mexico is still bringing quite a bit, but it's coming down. And then California is coming really strong, and North Carolina comes later in June. But the point of this is we always try to be early. Well, in the blackberry business, I think you're better off being late, because otherwise you're gonna hit that Mexico big numbers.
And to reiterate what we were saying just a few minutes ago, where you see Mexico fell off pretty quick, there was reasons for that, for weather. They had some weather issues, correct?
Correct.
Both cool weather and rainy weather, which caused them with quality to drop off, which helps the U.S. market, obviously. And Georgia, you see their volumes there, but at the same time, as we do another slide here in a second, you'll see the difference of what should have transpired or had the potential of transpiring from years past. And, theirs doing, as you can see, back in your weeks of what transpired throughout the years.
So this is a historical of all the years, all the crops, whatever it has crossed either the border or it is reported from the USDA. This data is from the USDA. This is not from WISH or from North American Dairy. This is US. And you can see we are almost the same. 23 had, Mexico had some big volumes, and then it still keep big volumes, but basically we're about the same. So,
And again, when he says that these are USDA.
I just moved
No.
here to individual areas so you can see volume, because the volume is so high in New Mexico early in the season that I have to put early weeks, so the graph kind of skews and it looks smaller. But you can see that California Central is coming starting to come about the same weeks as Georgia comes in, and it's sticking really good with North Carolina. And this is California South. Even more peaks on Georgia, because this is, I guess it will be like Oxnard kind of way, the south of California. So the competition with Georgia is not only with Mexico, but it's also with the California part. And this is Georgia. I love that. This is, it surprised me. The volume that we had last year was the lowest in the last 4 seasons. Even though I remember traveling and looking at the fields way before week 19, and it was packed full of flowers, and we were expecting quite a bit of fruit, but it didn't materialize. You can see that it was really poor yields in Georgia. If you have any questions when I'm doing this, just let me know.
So what do you attribute that to? That you had a good estimation and ended up?
We had, it was quite wet. It was really wet. The previous year, 22, was really hot. 23 was wetter, and none of my growers hit the yield that they've been used to hitting.
Like a chill too. We didn't have chill for 23 crops. That we needed. Depending on the variety.
He said lack of chill. The main variety in Georgia is Washington, basically.
Do you know what main variety they have in California?
I think they're growing some proprietary ones from some of the companies that work out of California mainly, and they also use some of the prime marks. Although they're getting away from it because it has quite a bit of regression. Prime mark.
And you traveling all around the world, what varieties they have in Mexico?
They have mainly one that is called Tupi, and it's about 20-some years old. Doesn't taste that great, but it ships very well. So that would come into the question that it was pre-selected by we'll touch that point later. This is North Carolina. And you can see these little bits is the primocane coming. Some of the North Carolina growers are starting to switch to Primark. Primark can give you a little bit of a yield in the spring and a little bit of a yield in the fall. It doesn't work in Georgia because Georgia is too hot for when the primocane flowering is happening, so that's why we don't use it in Georgia. But in North Carolina, especially western North Carolina and in the mountains, it works very well. And these are the prices by history. 24, I took it out because it's only 1 point, and it's over there. So these are the prices. You can see that when Mexico is peaking, prices are low, except these years have been very good. And then the domestic season comes in, And it stays high, and then it starts coming down over here. And these are prices by region. Mexico, Georgia, when Georgia hits, we try to get as much money as we can from the retailers, being a domestic crop, and sustainability, and just local fresh product. And we get California, and North Carolina is purple right there. North Carolina usually packs a little bit of a premium at the beginning. Quality is a little bit better, it's cooler. And then keeps on, I think it goes over here. You cannot see it, but it's somewhere around here. And then California continues. And then Mexico starts in October. Very hard month to get any fruit quality. There is very little in North Carolina. So supply is short. That's why the prices are better. And that's it for the graphs. What were the questions again?
So I came up with some questions to kind of prompt them to give us an overview, but we're also opening up to questions from the audience. Some of the other questions that we had was, what was just the average FOB price during the domestic window in 2023?
Take it back.
I think the average was somewhere in the ballpark of now, this is USDA. This is what is reported to USDA. The way this works, for y'all that don't understand, is USDA calls around once a week or once to twice a week, sometimes more than that, and they'll get the volumes from us and the pricing that we had during that time. And then they take all that and accumulate it into your worksheets you see here, and then they come up with their averages with, it could be anywhere from 12 marketers to 2 or 3 marketers. It depends on the time of the year and the location and the region. So it's an average that USDA puts out that where they have accumulated pricing from everyone that they can get to report. Now, what you see up here and what you've seen today is not everything that is grown. This is just what has been reported. Some don't report, some don't report on time, and there's different issues that happen with them as far as their reporting goes. So this is the best average that we basically have to work with as a general industry. So
It's our benchmark.
Yeah.
Whether it's right or wrong, that's the only thing we got. And the grower has, that's it, compared to the USDA.
You want to talk about quality during the 2023 season, and is there anything that stood out as being a consistent quality issue?
when it comes to quality, with blackberries, there's really 2 major issues that we see as far as, especially in the chains or anywhere else that pulls inspections. One is leaking, what they consider leaking fruit. That can stem, or soft fruit. That can stem from too much rain. It can stem from overripe berries. Some varieties don't take heat as well, and they'll leak. There's leaking that transpires sometimes if perhaps you're picking at a 90-degree day or a 95-degree day, what have you, and getting it into a cooler and getting it cooled off fast enough. If you've ever sit around a pallet of blackberries that come in July, you can feel the heat just radiating out of them. So it's extremely important to withdraw the heat as quick as you can through forced air situations. That is probably number 1. Number 2 is reversion red cell that everybody's totally familiar with, I'm sure, if you've been in the blackberry business. And there's really no rhyme or rhyme exactly to why that happens and when it happens. There's a lot of factors that come into it: heat, over extended time of ripening period if it was cool, cooling it too fast, not cooling it fast enough, too much nitrogen. There's all type of things that we think that comes into play with it, and some varieties are worse than others. So it's something that we try everything we can possibly to minimize it. And some varieties is not that bad at all with, but some varieties are worse than others. But quality, that's your biggest two. And when you get into leaking fruit, it doesn't take but a day or two, you're into mold. And when it goes into inspector, as soon as they see mold, it's an automatic rejection.
Yeah, one mold is rejected. It
That-
doesn't qualify as a USDA number one.
The unit, or the flat, or the pallet?
The whole load.
You know,
The whole truck?
They can reject the whole load, yes.
they take some samples out of each pallet, and if they found a mold, that's it.
The whole truck?
Yep.
Well, yeah. Depending on your receiver, you know, depending, there are.
They can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some stores will let it go, and you're lucky if you have one of those stores in your lineup, that some stores don't allow that.
And what normally happens with mold being the worst case scenario next to SWD or lava that comes from that is once they see that mold, then they automatically go to looking even harder. And they'll go through every pallet, which some of them will select pallets, you know, take 4 or 5 samples out of each pallet and grade on a percentage of the bear count and all that. But once they see a mold scenario, then they really micromanage the whole load. So and that's why sometimes you look at it and you say, well, you know, you may get some fruit back or look at it and think, well, there's nothing wrong with this fruit. It doesn't take a whole lot to throw things out of grade.
Is there harvester ID traceability on these, so that you will like if you have, you know, if it's a harvester, not a fruit quality issue, can the grower get back to the harvester? And, you know,
Yes, most all of the containers now have PTI stickers on them, which have the G10 numbers from the grower. And then normally the grower can take it back to fields. It's harder to take, some growers even have their field on it. Some even have maybe even their harvester on it with a stamp. But, you know, but it can be taken back to the data grower.
But if you get a rejection from one of your retailers, sometimes we cannot get that picture, that information. They
I
just
see.
say,
And is it then your product again, and it's up to you to do what you want?
well, if it is in the Northeast, and we are like we are in Plant City, sometimes we gotta throw it away, or take it to a terminal market, and get $2-3, or whatever we can to help the grower and ourselves. We put a lot of money on the freight.
Great, yeah.
And freight was a disease too, a really bad disease. It was really super high.
Yeah. Yeah, that's too.
And then I think the other question was,
Just looking forward, so thinking forward to trends you see for 2024, changes in packaging, anything you see coming down the pipeline?
the packaging, you all know, we usually are mainly 2 packages, 6 ounces and 12 ounces. I think there are some 18 ounces out there. I personally don't like 18 ounces, especially from the Georgia market, because the fruit just doesn't stand the 18 ounces for quality, so we got better chances for 12 ounces. And there are some innovations in packaging, like a split cell, that if it is 12 ounces, they are basically 2 6 ounces put together, that we try to ask the retailers to accept that package. So it's not as easy just to come up with a better package. You gotta convince them to take that package. I understand that there's also 18 to buy, 999, which that would make sense. For sure, we like bigger packages in order to move when we get to the peak of production. We would like the bigger package so we can move more volume out of the farms, and we try to move that. We are not as lucky like in blueberries. When this is the peak, we would start going with the 24 ounces and 18 ounces. And when you move the volume with your packages, and the blackberries, we're not that lucky. And I think the other question was about flavor and new varieties.
Yeah, so is there any opportunities for marketing, specific varieties or, clamshells that maybe have superior flavor?
Absolutely, every marketer is looking for that unique, different, that takes us different from the rest. We would like to have a sweet, large berry that does not doesn't have a regression and lasts a long time in the refrigerator.
The perfect berry.
And you all know I have enjoyed Dr. Clark's talks, and he said that that's what kept him for 40 years in the job. He never could find everything put together in one package, so we're still looking. But yeah, the consumer is looking for a sweeter berry, and in the Blackberry, the major complaint that we hear is consistency in flavor. When they buy one clamshell at the beginning of the season, it might be good, but then in the middle of the season, they buy the second clamshell, it tastes completely different. And so consistency of flavor is something that they're looking for. But yeah, the consumer is looking for a sweeter berry. I personally like a little bit more tart berry, like a normal blackberry used to be. But hey, to each his own.
It's kind of like every other fruit is going, as you well know, it's trying to go sweeter, crisper, scenarios. But there are a lot of proprietary varieties right now in the pipelines that are being worked on. But even with that being said, every region, the berry acts different in every region. Different soils. We may have, in the same region, we have two different farms and the soils are different. And the berries, they flavor different, they act different, they grow different. So it's just something that you really have to master yourself as far as growing. But if I was to leave you with anything as far as going into your season as a marketer, seller, if you would, is and I've always said this and I harp on it all the time, and it is just about, it is not impossible, but the better you can get your estimates, the better off we are as a whole altogether. Because the last thing we want to know is just like this year, there was a potential huge crop coming. There was a lot of fruit pre-sold to handle that big crop. Well, it didn't materialize. And the information coming in didn't come in quick enough to react. Most, just so you'll know, most buyers want pricing a month out. And you all know as well as I do, that's your whole season sometimes. And the weather changes drastically, at times. And, we don't know. One freeze event, one big major rain event, a cooling period to come through, it all shifts things 1 week. And if it shifts 1 week, just like you're seeing here, when you got California in, you've got Mexico finishing, you got Georgia coming in heavy, North Carolina is starting, that's a lot of blackberries hitting the market. So estimates are, do the best the very best you can. And it'll help you, it'll help us, it'll help everything, the whole market in general.
And before you plant anything, talk to your marketer. Don't go planting and then figuring out what to do.
Yeah, the worst thing in the world is somebody to come and say, well, I've got 15 acres, can you market my berries? Or what am I going to do with these berries? Yeah, definitely do your homework ahead of time and work with a marketer, try to find a marketer rather than just think you can grow them and somebody's going to take them, because the blackberry market right now, as far as North America goes, in these regions are they're loaded. Yeah, they're saturated. North Carolina's kind of flat at the moment. We've got some disease pressure in North Carolina with Therium wilt that's taken some of the varieties out. So we're in a transitional period in North Carolina, but at the same time, the acreages are leveling out. We're falling off a little bit, but the volumes will still seem to be maintaining for the most part. They're just shifting a little bit in the timing. So, and I assume Georgia's probably the same way, and and on up the road. So, and California now they're working with a substrate program that you just seen with the raspberries. They're working with a substrate program now to offset times of when they harvest. And that was one of the things that threw off this year too, that they were a little bit late coming in on what they would have had. And if they had it on time, what they were anticipating, then it could have potentially been another train wreck, from the opposite side, too much fruit on the market. So there's a lot of obstacles now. Everybody in the produce and fruit industries, everybody's trying to hit the very window that's open, you know, and nobody's to blame for that. But at the same time, as a grower, you need to realize that. So estimates are crucial.
Any questions?
We couldn't have been that good. All righty. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we'll use it tomorrow.
All righty. Well, we actually have next on the schedule a little break. So we have a 15-minute break from until 3 o'clock. If you all want to go stretch your legs, use the restroom, grab something to drink. We have 2 talks after the break, both on pest management. Dr. Aaron Cato is going to talk about some research on broad mite, and then Jonathan Oliver is going to give us an update on disease management. Because we did talk about some fruit disorders, I do want to point out that we have a new extension handbook on identifying fruit disorders, and we have some printed copies up here if anybody wants to grab one of those. The printed versions I have are in English, but we also have a Spanish language version, and I can tell you where you can find that one if you want to find that one online as well. So let's take a little break, and then we'll be back at 3 o'clock. Thank you. All right, everyone. I think we're going to try and start coming back. So if you'll find your seat, we'll kick things off for our last 2 speakers. Just a reminder, you'll see these orange sheets laying around. These are the evaluations for this session for today. If you will fill those out and then leave them by the little scanner that's up here on this black table as you leave today, Aaron will pick those up and we'll turn them in. We really appreciate, again, any feedback that you want to provide. It helps us determine how we shape these sessions into the next year. So we do take it seriously. Just a few reminders, we do start back tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. If you're looking again at your schedule, the first speaker is, it says David Bryla, but we're actually going to swap David Bryla for Amanda Davis. She's joining us remotely via Zoom. So we'll just swap those 2 speakers and then we'll proceed as normal. Also in the program, originally we had planned to do a farmer profile at the end, but unfortunately we're not going to be able to do that. So we'll wrap up a little bit early tomorrow. And then with that, again, very much appreciate your participation today, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Aaron Cato. He's a colleague of mine at the University of Arkansas, and he's going to give us an update on some research that he's been doing on broad mite and blackberry. Thanks for joining us, Aaron. I can't get it to go away.
We're going to find out. It's going to affect us. I hit cancel. I should go now. Okay, yeah, thanks for that introduction, Amanda. As she said, I'm also at the University of Arkansas. My name's Aaron Cato. I do integrated pest management there on all fruits and vegetables, so I work a lot in vegetables and a lot in fruit. And in Arkansas, I do a lot of research on caneberries, mostly just blackberry, and then also strawberry. But I'm really here to talk to you today about a pest that we kind of got first, and now everybody else seems to be getting, but it's broad mite. So if you have broad mite, can you raise your hand if you've dealt with it on your farm? Okay, so a number of people out there, and so sometimes you get into groups and they say they don't know what it is, but then the more you get out towards really North Carolina, Virginia, and then especially California, Mexico, and then you talk to any Europeans, they got it really bad as well. And so we've kind of been working with some of the little bit of research that's been done to try to improve some recommendations for y'all to more easily make pesticide decisions and kind of understand when you're going to get damaged with it. And also looking for some more options for you to use once you get broad mite. So for blackberry in general, especially in the southeast, I would argue that we really didn't have too many arthropod pests prior, maybe in like the mid-2000s and prior to that. You know, you've always had raspberry crown borer and some of the other boring pests, but you know, organic growers could get by pretty well with pretty good fruit quality later in the years outside of some disease issues that may pop up. But really that started to shift once we got into spotted-winged Drosophila, and that's what's really driving a lot of our treatment decisions in the southeast. And we know that especially when it's a cooler, rainier year, we can get pretty bad issues with fruit quality. And as they talked, some of the market guys talked about earlier, you can get shipments that are rejected for spotted-winged Drosophila. Because of that, we have a spray schedule that's pretty much used in almost all of the blackberries that are grown in the southeast. And these are utilizing a few broad spectrum insecticides if it's a conventional schedule. So things like pyrethroids, organophosphates, subcarbamates, things like that. And what we've seen from that is anytime that you use a weekly application of a broad spectrum insecticides, you get other pests that become issues. Things like scales, things like mealybugs. We've been seeing mealybugs in berries, and we've never seen that before. But when you spray a lot of Mustang Max and a lot of Malathion, then you start seeing those kinds of soft-bodied pests. Another one that we have seen a lot of are mites. And so whether it be spider mites in fields that we normally wouldn't see them, we've also got this broad mite. And the reason that is because pyrethroids are known to kill predatory mites. And so you can get a lot of knockback of these predatory mites, which can lead to some of the mite species and also some of the other small soft-bodied insects. So we actually got broad mite in the United States for the first time in blackberries before we had spotted-winged Drosophila. So 2007 is when they first found it in blackberry. They found it in Arkansas, luckily for us. But that was tunnel-grown blackberries. And as you know, with all tunnel-grown crops, you're going to get new pests. It wasn't until later in the mid-2010s till we started really seeing it on our field-grown blackberries, and specifically what we saw it on our primocane fruiters, because that's what they really deal the most damage to. They feed on the primocane of the blackberry, and so if you're growing a floricane fruiter, you can imagine a little bit less growth later in the year. You're not going to notice these problems as quickly as you do when they're feeding on flowers and fruit and actually causing direct yield loss. It's a microscopic mite. I can tell you a spider mite and go look out and you can find it on the leaf with your eyes or a small little jeweler's lens, but broad mite are very difficult to see with even a jeweler's lens. I can find them sometimes. Some people tell me they can find them easily. I don't know if I believe them all the time, but it really requires a microscope to actually see the mites, just a little dissection microscope. But once you look for them, they have these, it's hard to see in pictures, but you can see in the bottom down there, they're little polka dotted eggs. That's kind of the calling card for the fact that you have broad mite, but also these mice that have this like hourglass shape on the back outside of it. And so one of the big things is that their damage resembles oxen injury. And so most people think that their neighbor's been spraying a pasture or something and hit them with some kind of oxen herbicide, and that's kind of what they're looking at. But really it's just reminiscent of oxen, but it doesn't truly look like any of them. You can ask some of the weed specialists out here, they tell you that looks nothing like 2,4-D. So what we see for symptoms are, starting out, we see a lot of bronzing of the new growth. You'll see the terminals kind of point up. And normally they're growing out, they'll start pointing straight up, and they'll start getting this bronzed appearance, and the tips of the leaves will actually cup inwards a bit. And you see a lot of stacking of terminals, and you can see that the nodes are really close together, and that's what we'll see later on, is that the actual cane will stop growing, and you'll see a lot of nodes within like maybe 6 inches. We'll see 5 nodes, which is unheard of for blackberries that are grown healthily. And then the most iconic thing, I think, and this is when you know you have good or a lot of broad mite out there, are these wavy leaves where they get rolled up and they get wavy. We called it a lot of leaf cupping, and that occurs, but that's actually really occurring when we get worse damage. You can see here's an instance where we actually start to have some leaf cupping towards the back. It's a little harder to see in this picture, but it actually starts to lead to necrosis. And we can start seeing those leaves actually die and then shed from the plant, and we get tip dieback where it dies from the back all the way down the cane. So here's an example of that, where you can see tons of nodes that stacked up in one spot, almost looks like a bottle brush appearance, a lot of necrosis, and that cane doesn't grow after that. And so we can get some pretty serious damage, even on our floricane fruiters. This is a floricane fruiting plant. It's the primocanes of that fruit, but it is a floricane fruiting plant. And I believe this is on Patchy. It's like in July or something in Arkansas, or maybe early August. So what's the effect from broad mite on blackberry? What does that feeding truly cause? Outside of the tip dieback and primocane fruiters, it's direct yield loss. If you get them out there before you're getting your flowers through to production, and even some of the early fruits, they can lead to those fruits, not producing, get really bad fruit quality, things like that. You can see some of the pictures. This is all outlined by Don Johnson and some other people at U of A in the mid-2000s. And floricane fruiters, it's kind of more of a question mark. I'm not going to show you some of the data that we took on some floricane fruiting varieties, specifically on Ouachita, but we see a lot of stunted growth in the late summer, tip dieback, and we've actually seen where the affected buds don't break. So you can see here, those were those tight internodes where the year before we had a lot of injury, and those buds just didn't break the next year. But from what our data shows, you really need a lot of broad mite on a floricane fruiter before you're going to get into any trouble. So I'll talk about a threshold here in a minute. Right at threshold, we're not seeing injuries on floricane fruiters as much, but we definitely have fields, and I'll show you at the back end when I talk about our efficacy trials, were fields that were heavily affected that were fluorocane fruiters. So let's talk about the current recommendations. The whole stick of this is there's not much work that's been done on broad mite. Starting to pop up, it's a new pest. There really hasn't been much work out there. The recommendations basically say go out there and scout for symptomology. If you think you see it, you need to start looking at leaves for mites. But I'm an entomologist. A lot of my work is in integrated pest management. And so normally we'll tell you, say if you're a strawberry grower, go look at 10 leaves across a field or across an acre or so. And if you look at those 10 leaves, if you find X number of mites on those leaves, you need to spray, right? And that's what we truly need in a blackberry as well for broad mites, but that really doesn't exist. We don't truly understand what the sample size they use is going to give you an accurate depiction of what's in your field. And that's really important for primocane growers because you want to know before the mites start losing a lot of flowers whether or not a pretty cheap spray of like abamectin or something can get you somewhere with that. So right now what is recommended is a 10 leaflet sample. So go out there and pull 10 leaflets and then look at the mites on that and they'll tell you what's in your field. And I don't buy that really that much. I think 10 leaflets across an acre of blackberries is not going to tell you much. If you pull it in the wrong spot, you're not going to know if you have broad mites or not. And so that's the point of the research that we did here. The other thing is that most growers that we know that have broad mite, they're using visual symptomology to indicate whether or not there are broad mites in the field and how many. There's been no work to show to outline what symptoms mean how many broad mites are out there, and that's something that's really a need for research. So that's kind of a lead up to what we decided to do for some of our research. And this is actually some work from my graduate student, Jared, who since graduated in December. But our first thing was we wanted to establish a sample size. Say you have an acre of blackberries, you want to know, are there broad mites out there right now? Are they at treatable levels? What sample size do you need would be best for you to figure that out? So we looked at 5, 10, and 15 leaflets, and we wanted to see how many at each of those levels, how many samples would be needed to have an accurate sample. The next thing is we wanted to develop a visual rating scale. So give you something where you go out there and you can put a number to what you're seeing, or give it, especially to somebody working in your field, a number, and then have an average across a field of what rating or what symptoms you're seeing across that field that's easy to use. And then lastly, see if these visual sample or this visual symptomology or injury you're seeing correlates to the number of mites that are actually out in the field. So we performed this study at 2 locations, so specifically looking at the sample sizes. We did this in White County, Arkansas, and Washington County. We did it in 2022 and 2023. For the number of mites, we looked at 12 fields. We wanted to look at more, but once you start counting hundreds and hundreds of leaflets with mites, it takes hours and days and weeks. And so we were limited about how many fields we can actually look at. When we were looking at visual symptomology, though, we looked across 33 different fields. So we took about 3,000 cane samples in each of these 33 fields. So we got a lot of data on that side of it. And we actually developed our injury scale based on our observations that we had made across the 3 previous years. We had very bad broad mite injury in 2019 and 2020. And so we kind of took that understanding and made our visual scale before we did all this other research. So this is how the trial was laid out. We took a field. This one I think is maybe a 4-acre field. We would basically take 6 different routes down that field, or transects. You can see these lines here. And each of those we sampled 4 different areas. At each of those spots we took a sample of 5, 10, and 15 leaflets, and we also took 10 canes. Then we just looked at the canes and rated them for visual injury. So then we would have a full field with all of these samples, which would give us a reasonable idea of what the average number of broad mite was out there. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some statistical models we did. I'm not going to go too far into it. I'm just going to tell you that I did it really. And to try to compare those sample sizes from one area or 10 areas across the mean of the field. For visual injury, we did this exact same thing, but for 33 additional fields. But we wanted more canes because it only took like 30 or 45 minutes a field. So we did 5 different spots down a row and 6 rows per field, which ends up about 300 canes per field. So this is our visual injury rating scale. So it's a 1 to 5 scale. Basically, a 1 means that you've got a pretty good distance between your internodes. You can kind of see this is what blackberries look like whenever they are not infested with broad mites. They grow, they look like they're more trailing. Obviously, Ponca is not going to look exactly like that, and Ponca's kind of been a bit of a bane in our existence in creating this scale. Going to a 2, you start to see a little bit of leaf bronzing. Your internode length is decreasing. That's when you know you're at a 2. 3, you start to see these twisted leaves. Any type of cupping or twisted leaves, you know you've hit a 3, and we just mark it. As soon as we saw twisted leaves, we saw a 3. However, if we saw any necrosis on those leaves, then we indicated it was a 4. That usually meant there were more broad mite out there. And then 5 is when we saw leaf actually decline and saw tip die back. And so it's not just necrosis, but the leaves are truly dying. We threw a lot of statistical methods at this, and really the one thing I want you to understand is that whenever we talk about a threshold in any type of integrated pest management system, we're trying to figure out a sampling strategy that is not only accurate but also efficient. It's not going to take you tens of, thousands of hours to look at things. So I can tell you, you need to go out there and check every single plant, but you're not going to do it, right? So we want to know within a pretty reliable level of accuracy, how many plants can we look at? And so we use these models to look at 70, 80, and 90% accuracy. And normally in pretty much every threshold you use, it's set at a 70% accuracy. And so we think that this number of samples will get you within 70% of the true number of insects that are out there, or arthropods. And that usually is what we set it at. So that was our goal, was to find something at that level. So this is just a graph that shows the broad mite that we had that were present in the fields that we looked at. So I told you we looked at 12 fields, we counted numbers. So you can see here we have 12 fields. 4 of them we had pretty excessive numbers. So on the y-axis we have the number of broad mite adults plus immatures, which generally is what most people just call broad mite. And on the x-axis just the field. So you see 21, 13, 13, 7. Those are all pretty damaging populations. We had another 4 that were somewhere in this like weird threshold of 1 to 5. So 3.6, 1.8. 0.8 is pretty close, and 0.7. And then we had another 4 or so that were a little bit lower, 3 or 4 that were lower. One of them, we had a couple broad mites in one spot, which gave us an indication of a field that just had some broad mite in one spot, but it averaged out to actually to a 0 because it was only on a few leaves. And we had a couple of that were kind of lower. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but this is just kind of showing you what our models spat out, basically. So we had 5 leaflet samples, 10 leaflet samples, and 15. Each of these bars tells you how many of those leaflet samples you need to take in a blackberry field to be within 70% accuracy, 80 or 90. And like I said before, we don't care about 80 and 90 because look at the number. If you want 90% accuracy, you need to take 119 sets of 5 leaflets across your field to be accurate, to be 90% accurate. That's something, no one's going to be able to do that. It takes too much time. We looked at the variance and mean. That just means we had an average and how much difference did we get across it. And what we found from that was a 15 leaflet sample is probably going to be the best sample to look at, and you would need to do 11 of those across the field. So go out to your field at 11 different spots, pretty random, but also taken across the whole field, pull 15 different samples if you want to understand how many broad mites are out there, which is still a lot of work. And the reason why we look at the visual injury, because this is a lot of work to do. 15 leaflets, 11 sets of those, that takes about an hour in the lab to look at. It takes a while if you really want to count the number that's out there. So the other thing that we did was we looked at number of broad mites and visual injury. So on the y-axis, we have the number of broad mites. You can see here our red line. That's our 5 broad mites per leaflet threshold. On the x-axis, we have our visual injury scale. You can see we got up to about a 3.5 average in a field. And really what we saw from this was whenever we were approaching an injury level of 2, so when on average we saw bronze terminals, stacking of internodes, we really didn't see anything under that that had broad mite levels that were above threshold. But once we got to 2, and especially when we got to around 2.5, we didn't see anything that was under threshold. So if you went out into a field and you saw a lot of cupping leaves or leaves with necrosis, you needed to spray. And so in fact, 70% of our samples that had average visual injury rating of 2 or more were above threshold. So to us, this indicated we had a visual injury as a pretty good indication of being at threshold. We looked at the same thing for our sampling, right? So how many sets of 10 canes would you need to go look at in the field? And what we found was you only needed to really take 5 samples in a field. And we think you should probably do 10 just so you can get a more representative sample in a bigger field. But you only have to go out to 10 different spots and look at 10 canes to determine what your field range is for visual injury, which to us is a pretty easy sample to take. So in conclusion, our previous recommendation was 1 10 leaflet sample across the field, and they'll tell you what broad mites you have. We found that's not even close to enough. You really got to go take 11, 15 leaflet samples to get to that point. Looking at visual injury, you can use that as an indication of how many broad mites are in your field. Once you get a rating of 2, we found about 70% of samples were probably above threshold, which to us is a decent threshold for a visual injury. But I would say you want to average a bit above 2 before you would make a treatment decision. And so we think that's a way to go for floricane producers, but primocane producers is where it's really hairy because Once you're at a visual rating of 2, which is when you can realistically start to see them out there, you have broad mites already feeding on your flowers and fruit. And so visual systems are probably not going to be very reliable for primocanes alone. But if you're going out there to pull leaflets and you're seeing leaves that are cut already and it's easy to find, you need to spray. And there's no point in looking at those leaflets. You need to spray even in a primocane system. So you should be using both if you're looking at primocane fruiters and you have broad mite issues. If you don't have broad mite issues, I wouldn't waste a ton of time looking at leaflets if you've never had a broad mite issue, because it's very sporadic on who has it and who doesn't. All right, so moving on to the second part of my talk, it's what to use to control broad mite, right? So we got an idea of when we should be spraying, but what should you be spraying? And so right now our current thought, or the products that we use are Agromec, which is abamectin, or Magister, which is phenazequin. Those are the 2 miticides that we know that work. The issue is they both have a 7-day pre-harvest interval. In Arkansas, when we start getting issues with broad mite and floricane producers, it's usually right as Vaughn and Navajo are about 2 to 3 weeks of harvest left, so you can't spray those fields or you're going to lose a lot of your, as we just learned, most valuable fruit. And then primocane producers, you get a lot when you have your initial fruit that are coming on. So August, September, those are the worst months for broad mites, and so it's really hard to justify not picking for a week to spray these products. And so we're really interested in trying to find products that have a smaller pre-harvest interval, and so that's what the Southern Region Small Fruit Consortium actually funded us to look at, and that's what we've been looking at in the last couple of years. And so at the end of 2021, actually, Portal, which is fenperoxamate, it actually gained caneberries on its label. So it's not something we just went out and did. We were just lucky in getting that label added on. And the good thing is that Portal has a 1-day PHI. So when you spray it, 24 hours later from your spray, you can then start picking fruit from those plants. And so we initiated a few trials to assess how Portal compared to our known standards of Agromec, which is abamectin, and then also Magister, which is phenazequin, just to see how it compares, whether or not we would even recommend it. It's kind of the idea. So we looked at 5 plant plots. These are the plants that we sprayed it on. You can see here 5 plants. We would skip 2 plants, spray another 5, and then in between each row, we had a buffer row to make sure we didn't have any drift. Sprayed it with a CO2 backpack sprayer at about 60 gallons per acre. We have 2 trials that I'll talk about. One, we started on August 2nd in 2022, and then we resprayed it 21 days later. The populations bounced back so much that we just resprayed it to kind of see what would the second application do. And then when we resprayed that initial trial, we actually put a second trial out nearby that only looked at the 3 products I talked about before, which are Magister, Agromec, and Portal. And we looked at 0, 3, 7, 10, 14, 20, and further on, we looked at the number of broad mites that were there, and we also rated them with the same scale that I just showed you, just to kind of show you how that differed. And the last point is that we were oversprayed on September 10th. So we got a lot of good data, and then eventually the grower had a lot of broad mite in his other fields, and he oversprayed us. And so you'll see a spot where everything drops down. And that's because it was sprayed over by the miticide. So here are the 2 trials. The first one, we had an untreated. We had acetamiprid, which has some activity on mites. We wanted to see how that would work out. Hexythiazox, which is Savvy. This is often recommended for broad mites. We wanted to see how it would do. You notice they both have 1-day PHIs. Portal, Spearlep, which is this biological that person kept telling me it has miticide activity, so we wanted to see would it have any miticide activity on the broad mites, basically. And then Agromec, so we have our untreated, and we have our positive control, which is abamectin, which we know that works well. Our second trial, Portal, Magister, Agromec. So 2 products that we know do a pretty good job. We wanted to get some additional data. Portal, which we weren't 100% sure of, but when we put this out, we had some promising results, and then our untreated. So the data is going to look really messy, but I'm going to clean it up here in a second. On the y-axis, we just have number of broad mites. And remember when I told you that 5 is our threshold? This area that we sprayed these had a lot of broad mites. We saw a lot of necrosis. We saw a lot of tip dieback in our plots. And you can see we had our untreated get up to almost 80 broad mites per leaflet in that area. So it's a lot of broad mites. We have a couple things that just didn't work. They never dropped it back under threshold. So that's Spearlep, Hexythiazox, and acetamiprid. So purple, orange, and yellow, you can see purple never did a great job. Yellow, it grew just like with the untreated. I mean, acetamiprid seemed to keep them low, but if 8 times threshold is low, it's not great. And Hectothiasox kind of was on the same exact track as our untreated. So remove those, and we can kind of get an idea of our portal and Agromec and how it differed. So you can see everywhere you see an asterisk, that's where it's significantly different on that week or that timing compared to the untreated. And you can see that both portal and Agromec we sprayed. 7 days later, we got a pretty good reduction under threshold. So these plants started to bounce back. But immediately, portal, the numbers shot back up. So we just did not get the residual control that we normally see with Agromec. We did not see that with portal. Usually with Agromec, we spray and we don't see broad mite again for at least 21 days. And that's exactly what our data showed. At 21 days, they start to bounce back. But normally, we spray late enough that we may never see them. But we have places definitely where we spray and we spray again a month and a half later or so. We sprayed again at 21 days, so we took all of our samples. What we saw was that portal had broke a lot since the last couple of weeks, and also our untreated was still high, so we said, heck, we'll put a second shot out there and see what it looks like. So you can see it falls back down. Portal still got that population back under control with the second application, so we think portal does a pretty good job with knocking the population down. Agromec obviously is still the best product, of the ones we looked at here. Show you the same thing, but for now it's on the y-axis is our rating. So you can remember I said somewhere between that 2 and 2.5 is where we know we have a lot of broad mite out there, and it followed really well with what our ratings showed before. You can see the untreated, pretty much everything was about at a 2, 2.5 when we sprayed. We knew broad mites were out there, and it climbed all the way up to a 4.5. So pretty much every cane we looked at had necrosis or was shedding leaves. Portal knocked it back down to where it was well under threshold, but by 14 days, we were back above where we would suspect to have to spray again. We sprayed again at 21 days, and you can see it knocked it back down at that point. So here's the second trial that I talked about. This is just portal, Magister, and Agromec. Sprayed once again at 0 days. You can see here it started much higher. We had a lot of broad mite out because we sprayed later. Able to get these populations under control very well. Agromec, even at a huge population, knocked it way back down to almost 0. It's hard to get everything out because we have all those buffer plants nearby, so you're always going to get a little bleed in afterwards. But Magister, same thing, looked pretty similar. Portal didn't quite have as quick of a knockdown. You can see at 3 days, it's taking a little longer. But at 7 days, I mean, it was significantly different from the untreated. These were all similar. They're all under threshold. So it does a good job in that time period. But all of them bounced back. Or really, Agromec didn't bounce back as much, but Magister did some. So it seems like Magister may suffer a little bit with the lack of residual, similar to portal, but where Agromec still is just the Cadillac of the products for broad mite. Here's the same thing for the ratings again, visual injury. You can see we started at a 3.5, so these are plants that had broad mite for a while. Everything knocked under our threshold except for portal. It never quite got it there, and then eventually our untreated fell down after this number. So in conclusion, portal is a good option to use when your pre-harvest interval is important. Our data shows that even with very large broad mite populations, it'll knock it back down to where it's in a manageable state, specifically late floricane harvest or in your primocane fruiters when you have to use it. It's got a 1-day PHI, so that's really the place for it. I would not just use portal because you have it and you just have broad mites. I would only use it if you have that 1-day PHI because from our data, it seems it may bounce back on you, whereas Agromec wasn't as privy to doing that. Magister seems to be as good as Agromec for the most part. It seems like it maybe doesn't quite have the same residual activity. Many places that we've seen need multiple shots to get to the season, and this is just thinking about the Southeast. When you start considering like California or something, or Mexico, it's a whole different world that I don't know that I fully understand. They may have to use all these products to make it work. But I would always recommend Agromec plus a surfactant first, and then you want to start thinking about what to rotate with. So whether it's using portal or Magister, something you may need to rotate with that. The big iffy part here is that you only get 2 applications of portal a year, and you can't do an application of portal and then another one until more than 14 days have passed. So it's a label restriction. So if you're in harvest and you still have 3 weeks of harvest left, you're only going to get 1 application of portal probably to get you to that time. And so don't do it too early, but in primocane harvest, it may be hard to do it too early. But rotation is always going to be key. In other mite species, Agromec works really well, and then the second time, it does not work well at all. In broad mite so far, we've seen 2 applications of Agrimec work just as well every time, but usually the second application is occurring late in the year and the broad mites are going away anyway once it gets cold. But I would never recommend spraying Agrimec twice in a row. I would either probably try to rotate it with Magister and have Portal on hand just in case you need it early. But I think that's all I got. I'm going to leave some of these resources up for you if you don't have any information about it, but that's just the guidebook, obviously, that Jonathan's the main editor on. And then we also have our YouTube channel where we have some different things about disease management. We're going to do a broad mite scouting guide on, and then also our podcast where we bring in people from North Carolina, Georgia, and other places to talk about a lot of the issues that are shared here today. But I got a few minutes for questions, and I'm the moderator, so we can be here all day if y'all want. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
What about the container size and Magister? I'm a small grower, only 3 or 4 acres. It's a 2.5 gallon,
Yeah,
and up to this year, I've been unable to get it.
yeah. I think it's that, and Portal's the same way. It's also 2.5 gallons, but it's got a Magister and Portal. The rate is a lot larger, so 2 pints for Portal. I forget the rate on Magister, but I don't think they're going to increase. They're going to decrease the container size. Agrimec's always going to be the easiest, or whatever version you get of, it's going to be the easiest one to find because there's so many generics out there. But we've had a lot of growers had issue finding Magister, which is why we did some work on it because no one really uses it from our experience. But, yeah. Any other questions?
Tank mix anything with the
We always use a non-ionic surfactant, and so it won't work without the surfactant. I think I have that on one slide, but I failed to mention it. We don't put an ovicide with it. I'm trying to remember, we have egg data on it as well, and that's always been the problem with abamectin and other crops, or really for two-spotted spider mite, is it kills motile mites, so it kills immatures, it kills adults, but it doesn't kill eggs. From what I understand, it does a pretty good job on broad mites. We never saw too much of a bounce back quickly, which to me would mean the eggs kind of went down into the tank or the hole as well. But I need to look at the egg data to see. We didn't tank mix anything with it, though. All of the products that I showed you, we use a non-ionic surfactant. If you don't use it with abamectin, it may not work. The first year I was working in this position, I put out an efficacy trial and got 0 control with abamectin because I didn't put an NIS in it, and that was tough learning for that one. Yeah.
shelf life, Magister Portal?
I've got no clue. I don't know that it's any different. I would ask one of the guys down in the trade show tomorrow about that, but we've been using abamectin in some of our plots that's been around for a few years, and it works great. Yeah, but I'm not 100% certain. No, this is the first year we've even looked at Magister and Portal, so I don't know. Is my time up? Okay, I gotta end before they get mad. So our next speaker is going to be Jonathan Oliver. Do you know how to get this thing down? I don't use Macs. I don't know how many of you use Macs, but I'm uncomfortable using a Mac. Oh, here we go. So Jonathan Oliver, he is a small fruit disease specialist at UGA. That's close enough. There we go. I believe this works. I'm not 100%.
Thank you, Aaron. So yes, good to be here. My name is Jonathan Oliver, and I am the fruit pathologist and extension specialist at UGA, and I'm based out of Tifton. And today I'm going to talk to you about cane diseases of blackberry and give a disease management update. So I'm going to talk about some of the diseases we saw during the 2023 growing season in Georgia briefly, and then I'll spend most of my talk talking about how do we manage cane diseases on blackberry. I'll talk some about the seasonal spray schedule for commercial blackberry production, and then I'll end by providing you with a couple of additional resources. So first, what diseases did we see in Georgia during 2023? Based on samples submitted to the Plant Disease Clinic in Athens, 15 issues were diagnosed on blackberries in Georgia. That's a relatively low number, so we didn't see a lot more than average anyway of diseases this year, but we saw some of the things we do see pretty routinely. We had some locations with some significant issues with cane blight, and we also saw orange cane blotch on some of the samples that were submitted. We continue to have a lot of cane and leaf rust throughout Georgia. I can pretty much go out to any blackberry field almost any time of the year in Georgia and find some cane and leaf rust. But it's pretty easy to identify, so that it isn't always reflected in the number of samples that get submitted to the lab. We also see a lot of leaf spot caused by Pseudocercospora, especially as the season goes on, and we did have a couple of growers who had some significant leaf spots to the point where their plants defoliated a little bit early with that disease. We also saw some minor root disease issues this year as well. So I'm going to talk about managing cane diseases on blackberry. I'm going to focus on orange cane blotch and cane blight and cane dieback that I'm going to talk about together. So these cane diseases can be pretty significant in the southeastern United States. Orange cane blotch, cane dieback, and cane blight are typically what we have the most problems with in Georgia. So orange cane blotch is kind of an atypical disease. It's actually caused by an algae. Most diseases, as you probably know, of crops are typically caused by like fungi or bacteria or viruses, but in this case it's actually an algae. And this algae, of course, algal species have a significant association with water, and it actually produces sporangiophores, these spore structures that release zoospores, and these are spores that are capable of basically swimming through water or films. The sporangiophores, when they're present on the surface of the cane, basically give it an orange and felt-like appearance, and so orange cane blotch can also be called orange felt disease. The blotches that appear on the canes often eventually will dry out and turn white and crack open. And we think actually the most significant impact of orange cane blotch on blackberries is that those blotches eventually crack open and provide wounds that other perhaps more significant, even more significant pathogens can use to enter that cane and cause further disease. This disease is associated with yield loss. It's been shown through research done prior to my arrival at UGA that if you have large numbers of these blotches, you will see a yield impact on your blackberries. These blotches can also be mistaken for rust because of that orange color. So research that we've done in my program, some observational work we've done in the field suggests that infection of new primocanes only occurs once, or during one period anyway, during the year. And that in the sites that we looked at in South Georgia happened around late May through July. And the way we figured that out is I had a graduate student who did some field observations and also brought samples back to the lab to look at them under the microscope and determine when these reproductive structures of the algae was present, and also did some photography work in the field where we took these canes, we tied them to wooden stakes, and he was able to take pictures actually every other week through the entire life of those canes and see how the blotches developed on those canes. And so eventually the entire cane surface becomes covered with those blotches, but as you kind of go back in time here, from floricanes to primocanes, you begin to see distinct blotches, and you see where they initially started. So you can first begin to see these blotches as little tiny red dots in June and July, and really by September, all of the blotches that are going to be present throughout the life of that cane are already present. And so that is an indication that the infection of those primocanes is occurring in a fairly small window early on in the life of that cane. And that is also when my graduate student identified these spore structures being present on the floricanes is also during that window. So we think that's when the algae is transferring itself to those new floricanes. We do not see new infections on floricanes during year 2. But given that this is basically a monocyclic disease, it just has one period of infection, management practices for orange cane blotch are most likely to be effective if we're targeting that initial infection, and we're focusing on preventing primocane infection during the late spring or early summer. Again, that for us was late May and through July when we saw sporulation and new infections occurring. So some of our management practices that we can implement for orange cane blotch are cultural practices. Removal of the older floricanes after harvest can be important. Again, the floricanes are where that algae is sporulating. And if once those floricanes have fruited and we've harvested the fruit, all those floricanes are doing from a disease management standpoint is just harboring disease that can then reinfect those, or it can infect the newly developing primocanes. And so getting it out of there early may reduce disease spread in this case, especially since harvest for us is usually June, early July, and that's when we were seeing sporulation on those old floricanes. Anything to promote rapid drying of the canopy can help. Again, it's an algae. Water is important in the life cycle of this pathogen. So if we can reduce the amount of weeds we have, maybe using weed-free strips or black plastic, we can reduce the holding capacity for moisture within the canopy. So those weeds are there, they retain moisture, the sun can't dry out the canopy as easily, and that provides the moisture the pathogen might need. And so if we can reduce that, perhaps we can reduce issues with orange cane blotch. Same thing with drip tape irrigation instead of overhead irrigation. That has a potential to impact this disease. Stressed plants due to nutrient or water stress are more vulnerable to these types of diseases. And certainly, since this pathogen is basically sucking all of its own nutrients and water from the plant, it's putting the plant under additional stress as well. And so we don't want any other stresses present. And in poorly drained sites, not only are the plants stressed, but of course those sites are going to stay wetter and potentially be better sites for orange cane blotch development. And we have a lot of kind of low-lying areas in South Georgia, and some of them are, of course, planted in blackberries, where this can be an issue. Anecdotally, one other thing that may have an impact is that we've noticed that growers who tie up their primocanes earlier, basically do whatever they can to limit ground contact by the primocanes, may see somewhat less of an infection with orange cane blotch. And that makes sense because the lower the cane is, the more likely, the wetter it's going to stay, and also the spores are going to splash down onto it from above from those primocanes. So that makes some sense why we might be seeing that trend. So from a chemical control standpoint, really the only type of product that's been effective for use against orange cane blotch has been these phosphonate fungicides. Specifically for our trials, we've used Prophyte. The applications of Prophyte in our trials have been shown to dramatically reduce the numbers of spots on primocanes and also modestly reduce the size that these blotches achieve. So you can see our data was taken here from 3 field sites in Lanier and two sites, like I said, in Urban County, so 3 sites. And you see the same trend. When we sprayed Prophyte, the numbers of spots dramatically went down relative to the plants we did not spray with Prophyte. And you could also see a significant but only modest reduction in spot size when we applied Prophyte at all 3 of these locations. So what does that mean? Well, the number of spots theoretically, what we're assuming them to be are the number of infections that occur. And so basically it's reducing the number of infections that occur. And once those infections do occur, it's also reducing the growth of the pathogen and those blotches after infection occurs. So based on that and the information we have of when this disease is spreading to primocanes, optimal control with Prophyte should be focused on preventing infection of the primocanes in the first place. And to do that, then application should be initiated after the new primocanes emerge during this pre-harvest period, basically, in Georgia. And this would correspond to late April. And then once those primocanes have emerged and you've begun spraying them in late April, the label allows for 6 applications, and those applications can be made every 3 to 4 weeks. And that should basically get you entirely through that infection period and reduce the number of spots that you see eventually develop. One of the sites where we did our trial work a few years ago, I was in that site again this spring. We actually took a class of graduate students out there to look for blackberry diseases. And one of the things we assumed we'd find a lot of would be orange cane blotch, because we'd seen it in our trials. We actually didn't find very much of it this year, but the grower has, since our trial work was carried out, has been using this approach of spraying Prophyte during that time period, and he's dramatically reduced his issues with orange cane blotch. So we were glad to see that, even though I had been trying to find examples of the disease to show the students. So we also, as I mentioned, have other cane diseases like cane dieback. So this issue is frequently observed in established blackberry fields in southern Georgia. Basically, individual canes or sometimes the entire plant will decline, it'll collapse, and it'll die. The leading contributor to this dieback of blackberry has been believed to be cane blight. So what is cane blight disease? So cane blight is caused by the fungus Leptosphaeria coniotherium. It has fungal spores or canidia that are spread by rain splash, and they infect the canes through wounds. They need a wound to get in the first place. And so the lesions caused by cane blight appear on the primocanes in the summer, fall, and winter, and ultimately these lesions expand, and once these lesions have girdled the entire cane, that cane will die above that point. So you can see here in these pictures, the canes basically appear either a brown or a gray to silver color. The silvery part of the color may be due to the actual spores being released by the fungus. So if you look real close, you can see these little black pimples on the surface of canes that are infected with cane blight, and those fungal structures, those pycnidia, will be releasing spores that can then be splashed onto other canes and infect. So for cane blight management, the recommendations revolve around reducing wounding of the canes. So cultural practices, we want to avoid wounding the primocanes whenever possible. Unfortunately, blackberries have a tendency to self-wound a lot. So, just by growing those canes up, if they're thorned blackberries, the wind can bump the canes into one another, and those thorns can wound nearby canes. Even if they're thornless blackberries, when they're up on the trellis and the wind blows, they can rub on that trellis wire, and we sometimes see infections with cane blight starting at that point. And also, of course, the primocanes have to be pruned potentially multiple times during their life. So therefore, it would be better to prune them when they're smaller and kind of maintain them at the height you want, rather than letting them vastly overgrow your trellis system and having to come in with either some kind of mechanical pruner or large loppers, because you leave behind a larger wound that would take the plant longer to seal off and would be there longer for the pathogen potentially to enter through that wound. We recommend, of course, removing infected canes and old floricanes after harvest to prevent spread to the primocanes, and things that promote drying of the canopy also, as I mentioned before, and avoiding nutrition and water stress can help with this disease also. Chemical controls for cane blight include applying fungicides that are broad spectrum, like Raleigh and Pristine. And so after each day you prune, if you go out and prune, if you apply those types of fungicides, theoretically you're protecting that wound from subsequent infection by the cane blight pathogen until that wound can kind of naturally heal itself off. And whenever possible, whenever you're pruning, since rainfall is so important for this disease spreading, it would be good to avoid pruning prior to rainfall events. Ideally, if it was going to be dry for 3 or 4 days, that would be the time to prune. Not to try to get out there early and it's going to rain this afternoon. We have seen a lot of issues with cane blight, especially in years where it's just rains every day and it's really impossible to get out there and do the pruning that needs to be done without it being done, right before a rainfall event. And then that can really, the disease can take off and really wipe out entire plantings. So we have reports of cane blight every year. We receive those from growers, but we don't always see the true cane blight pathogen, that specific fungus out there. So we don't always see Leptosphaeria coniotherium in those affected plants. And so from this, we've done some work to identify other fungal organisms that are present that also appear to be causing similar symptoms here in Georgia on these infected plants. So our investigation into these other dieback organisms, what we did is we had a graduate student over a couple-year period go out and collect isolates from canes showing dieback symptoms. So he collected 126 fungal isolates from 8 counties. Among these isolates that were collected again from canes showing dieback, he actually only identified the cane blight fungus once. And so definitely there were a lot of other organisms there as well. But which of those were just there and which of those were actually contributing to the dieback, we investigated that. We inoculated the cut ends of potted blackberry plants, and we observed whether dieback occurred after inoculation with some of those isolates. And so In some cases, we saw significant dieback caused by by some of these fungal isolates. In other cases, the dieback could eventually affect the entire plant, and almost all the canes would die. This picture was taken 13 weeks after we initially inoculated the plant, and you can see it side by side with the plant that we did not inoculate with this particular isolate that was perfectly healthy. So we saw this with some of these isolates. They were very capable of causing dieback. So the types of organisms that we saw that caused significant dieback, we saw we had a fusarium isolate, we saw Lasiodiplodia, Pestalozziopsis, Neofusicoccum, Caulotoxicum, and Lasiodiplodia. Several of these are in the Botrytis feriacea family, and this family is known to potentially cause these types of symptoms on dieback from wounds. But these caused significant dieback. We had a lot of other isolates that, of course, didn't appear to cause any type of dieback in our assessment. But how can we control these different types of fungi? We conducted some trial work to look at that also, and that trial work thankfully indicated some fungicides that may be effective at preventing dieback. So again, on potted blackberry plants, we cut some of the cane terminals to simulate pruning. We sprayed different fungicides on the different plants. I think we used 8 fungicides in this trial. Then we inoculated the cut-in with a fungus, and we eventually removed the plug where the fungus was and observed the dieback over the course of a month to observe if the fungicide we applied before we inoculated was capable of preventing dieback caused by that isolate. So what did we see? So this table summarizes those results. So the plants that were not treated with fungicide generally showed the highest levels of disease. More disease is in red here, less disease is in green, caused by each of these these are each different fungal isolates. But you can see at the bottom of this chart, the plants treated with these fungicides generally have green shaded numbers here next to them. And that indicates that spraying Switch, Pristine, and Incognito generally reduce the amount of dieback we observed after inoculation of these plants. Incognito is, the active ingredient is thiophanate methyl. It is not labeled for use on blackberry, but thankfully Switch and Pristine are. And so these may be important chemical control tools to use, again, after pruning events to prevent dieback caused by some of these fungal organisms. The cultural controls for dieback are likely to be similar to what I talked about for blight, so I won't go through those again, but we'd expect them to cause similar types of diseases, again, entering through wounds, et cetera. So I'm going to talk briefly about the seasonal spray schedule for blackberry, including some of the other major blackberry diseases that I have not touched on yet, and some key spray dates and timings. So there are many major diseases of blackberry, and in a given location, in a given year, all of these can cause issues in blackberry production. All of these are present in the southeastern U.S., but they may not be present in your area. So we actually rarely ever see anthracnose in Georgia on blackberries, but most of the rest of these we've seen at least to some degree. A lot of the cultivars that are currently used have some resistance to double blossom, so we don't see that very much. I'm told it was a much more major issue 15 to 20 years ago. But we typically see, in a very wet year, lots of problems with cane blight in South Georgia. We definitely see Pseudocercospora and Septoria leaf spot, and we also see a lot of cane and leaf rust, as well as orange cane blotch that I've talked about, and Phytophthora root rot. And all of these diseases typically require in-season management. So what would managing all of those diseases simultaneously look like? So this is a slide I made. It's just an example. I'm not endorsing any of these particular products, but as an example, what could you use to control all of these major diseases that I've just talked about? So this slide shows the different developmental stages of blackberries across a season, so from the delayed dormant to after harvest, and the colored bars indicate when control of those diseases may be optimal or when those diseases are present. And above this line, I've indicated with some names of fungicides, potential products that may provide control if used at that time of these different diseases, and I've color-coded that. So for example, in the delayed dormant period, some growers utilize sulfurics or lime sulfur applications, and that can reduce disease carryover of things like anthracnose, spur blight, or cane blight. Once the plants start to grow, all the way through harvest, there's a lot of basically you're concerned about almost all of these diseases. Something like switch and captan may be needed for botrytis. Pristine actually has efficacy against several of these pathogens, so it's in black here. Rally is very effective against powdery mildew and rust. As you move towards harvest, kind of this pre-harvest period, that's where applications of Prophyte become useful for control of orange cane blotch. After harvest, at pruning events, Pristine or Rally may be effective. And when you're concerned about leaf spots, kind of towards the end of the season, the last several months of the season really, multiple applications of something like Tilt may be needed for control. So a couple of additional resources that can help you develop your own spray program. Aaron's already mentioned, but we have the 2023 Southeast Regional Caneberry Guide that's available at smallfruits.org. The 2024 edition is in process, but the 2023 guide is, of course, very similar and should still be relied upon at this point. In that guide, my two favorite pages as a pathologist are this one, the Seasonal At-a-Glance Fungicide Spray Schedule Options for Caneberries. It's a table that kind of looks similar to the spray schedule I showed you before, has the different developmental stages across the top, from delayed dormant to after harvest, and it has, in each column, it'll have the diseases that are most important at that time. And after each disease, it has a list of fungicides that are recommended in the guide for control of these diseases. The only real change in this chart from 2023 to the upcoming edition that's coming out in 2024 is the DMI fungicide Sevia has been added here. We expect it to be useful against rusts and leaf spots in a similar way that Tilt is because of the mode of action. One advantage of Sevia, though, is that unlike Tilt, it does not have a 30-day PHI. It has a 0-day PHI, so it could be used close to harvest if you're having issues with leaf spots or rust. The other chart that I like is this efficacy of selected fungicides against caneberry diseases chart. It lists a lot of the different fungicides or types of fungicides that are labeled and recommended for use in commercial blackberry production on the side, and then the columns are the different diseases, the major diseases that affect blackberries. So you can look down, if you're having issues with Pseudocercospora, for example, you could look down this column and find fungicides that are good, very good, fair. You can find the fungicides that may be useful against that disease, or if you're putting out an application of something, let's say, like Pristine for botrytis, you may also see that it's excellent for several other diseases as you go down the row. So this chart is particularly useful. Again, I've added Sevia here. We expect it to be similar in efficacy against rusts and leaf spots to Tilt, a product that's been used for many years on blackberries. We also have a lot of this information, including the pictures I showed, as well as the fungicide efficacy information available through the My IPM app. And this app is completely free through the App Store or Google Play. And it's actually available for a lot of different fruit crops. You can pick whichever fruit crops that you would like to download it for. And there is a disease portion for blackberries there. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have. Yes, sir.
Rate and interval on the profile of phosphinates.
I don't like to quote numbers out loud because I always like to look at the label first. But as far as the label on Prophyte, it can be applied 6 times for orange cane blotch. And I think it can be applied every 14 days, but typically 3 weeks to a month is kind of how we've made our applications for our trial work. But I would have to look at the label to be sure on the exact rate. I think it's a 4-pint rate, but again, I'd have to look at the label to be sure.
What were the primary varieties of blackberries that you saw that you were testing for the orange?
So when I started here UGA 6 years ago, Osage and Ouachita were by far the most common varieties. So all of that trial work was actually done in those varieties. We have seen it on some of the other varieties that have been put in, but those 2 varieties are almost all the trial work we did. So.